There is a room in the dead library where the air never moves. Dust hangs motionless, suspended in a silence that feels older than language. At the center sits a single empty chair, angled slightly toward you, as if someone once occupied it but left mid-sentence. This is where the codex rests, not glowing, not whispering, simply waiting, the way you waited for words that never came. Before you approach the chair, the codex asks a question without ink or sound. When did silence begin to feel normal? You know the answer, though you pretend you don't. It began the first time someone hurt you and walked away untouched. It began the first moment you realized some people will break your heart and call it just how things are. The empty chair is not symbolic, it is historical. The Codex of Apologies does not punish you for wanting closure. It punishes the ones who taught you to stop expecting it. Every page contains a silence you inherited, the apology a parent never gave, the truth a friend avoided, the correction a lover refused to make. They believed silence freed them. Instead, it imprisoned you. This book opens only when you're ready to admit how heavy that silence really was. When you step closer, the empty chair creaks slightly, though nothing touches it. It is the sound of an unfinished sentence, a breath held too long, a wound waiting for acknowledgement. You can almost feel the outline of the person who should be sitting there. Their absence has weighed heavier than their presence ever was. The Codex keeps their silence preserved perfectly, like a specimen trapped under glass. The first page does not begin with an apology. It begins with the truth. You whispered to yourself when no one else would say it. I deserved better. The room grows brighter for a moment, as if the dust itself glows in agreement. This volume does not give you the words they owed you. It gives you the space to stop pretending you didn't need them. And before the Codex speaks, the chair shifts once more, waiting for your honesty. There is a page in the Codex that trembles before you even touch it. Not out of fear, out of grief. It holds the apology that would have changed your life. The one that could have softened the wound before it scarred. The one you replayed in your mind so many times, it became a lullaby and a nightmare. This apology did not just matter. It was the hinge your entire story could have turned on. When the page turns itself, the empty chair tilts forward as if someone invisible finally leaned in to speak. For a moment, you feel the outline of the words you deserved. I shouldn't have done that to you. But the page remains blank, because the person who owed you those words never learned how to hold their own guilt. They left you carrying both the wound and the explanation, a double weight you never asked for. The Codex then reveals the truth you've avoided. That apology would have saved you, not because of the words themselves, but because they would have proven you weren't imagining the pain. Validation is a kind of oxygen. You suffocated without it. Every time you questioned your own memory, your own worth, your own right to hurt it, was because that apology never arrived to anchor your reality. The room shivers lightly, as if an unseen presence walked through it and vanished. You realize then that the apology was never withheld out of ignorance. They knew. They always knew. They just couldn't face what they did, so they let you carry the damage alone. The apology that would have saved you was swallowed to protect their comfort, and you learned to call that betrayal normal. The Codex does not try to comfort you. It simply shows the cost of silence. The years you spent trying to heal without clarity, the relationships you entered afraid, the moments you shrank because you believed pain was always your fault. That missing apology didn't just hurt you in the past, it shaped you. And this chapter is the first time you've allowed yourself to admit that truth without flinching. There are pages in the Codex that feel lighter than the rest, yet somehow hurt more. These are the apologies you stopped waiting for, not because you healed, but because hope slowly eroded into resignation. You convinced yourself you didn't need their words. You taught yourself to move on without closure. But the Codex remembers the truth. You didn't stop wanting the apology. You stopped believing it would ever come. The empty chair in the room tilts just enough to suggest someone once faced you, then turned away. Not abruptly, not cruelly, just softly, like fading trust. These are the apologies you grew around, the way a tree grows around a nail hammered into its side. The pain didn't leave. You simply learned to function while carrying it. The Codex records what you hid even from yourself. Your ability to survive does not erase what you deserved. The next page reveals sentences that would have changed everything. You did nothing wrong. I should have protected you. You didn't deserve that. These are the words you needed to hear, not to feel better, but to feel real. To know your pain wasn't imagined. To know your memory wasn't distorted. The Codex whispers that validation is not weakness, it's oxygen. But instead of receiving those words, you created your own explanations. You blamed yourself. You minimized the wound. You became fluent in excuses that protected their image and destroyed your own. The Codex turns another page with a soft sigh of regret, your regret, the regret of rewriting your story to make room for someone else's irresponsibility. These unsaid apologies shaped you quietly. They influenced how you trust, how you love, how you forgive, how you flinch, and how you protect yourself. The Codex does not accuse the people who should have apologized. It simply shows the fallout of their silence. How you built a life on foundations you didn't choose. Carrying the weight of sentences, they refused to speak. Some silences in your life were loud enough to become history. They didn't arrive suddenly. They seeped in slowly, rewriting the meaning of what happened. The Codex opens to a page filled not with ink, but with blank space shaped like the things you were never told. People think silence is passive, but the room reminds you, silence is an author. It writes its version of events when the truth is too heavy for them to carry. You learned early that silence can be weaponized. When they refuse to explain, refuse to acknowledge, refuse to meet your eyes, the silence spoke instead. It was your fault. You're too sensitive. You shouldn't feel this way. You didn't hear these words out loud, but you lived as if they were scripture. The Codex exposes the lie. Their silence was never your responsibility to interpret. The empty chair tilts backward now, as if leaning away from accountability. You recognize this posture. You've seen it in real life. Someone sitting there, pretending they did nothing, acting confused about your pain. The Codex makes one truth undeniable. When people refuse to speak, they force you to carry both the wound and the meaning of the wound. Their silence made you the historian of your own hurt. The next page reveals how silence twists memory. Not because you forgot, but because you kept trying to rewrite the story so their behavior made sense. You softened details. You erased moments. You blamed yourself to preserve the relationship. The Codex doesn't punish you for this. It shows compassion. People rewrite their pain when the truth threatens to break them in two. Silence changed who you became. It made you cautious with your voice, hesitant with your needs, careful with your truth. You learned to apologize for existing before anyone accused you of anything. You learned to anticipate disappointment before it arrived. The Codex gently closes partway, reminding you of something essential. Their silence was not wisdom, power, or certainty. It was avoidance, and you mistook it for meaning. There is a sorrowful page in the Codex covered not in ink, but in echoes. These are the apologies you whispered for them. The justifications you invented, the excuses you crafted so the wound wouldn't feel as sharp. You stood in the empty chair for them, speaking the words they refused to say, not because you wanted to protect them, but because you were desperate to protect yourself from the truth. You told yourself they didn't mean it, that they were overwhelmed, that they didn't know better, that they were hurting too. These explanations were your armor, fragile as paper, but better than facing the weight of their silence. The Codex reveals how often you stepped into their guilt, carrying it like a cloak to stop the cold from reaching your heart. The empty chair tilts again, this time backward, an unmistakable refusal. You recognize this posture. You've seen it when someone knew they were wrong but hid behind technicalities, moods, or distractions. You apologized first. You apologized more. You patched the wound with words they should have spoken. The Codex doesn't condemn you. It understands why you chose the pain of admission over the terror of abandonment. The next page reveals something you've always known but avoided saying aloud. Every time you apologized for them, you taught your heart a dangerous lesson, that your pain was negotiable, but their comfort was sacred. You learned to shrink your truth so it wouldn't disrupt their story. You learned to forgive before you were even hurt. You learned to bend your boundaries until they snapped in silence. These borrowed apologies cost you more than the original wound. They made you responsible for their character. They made you the guardian of someone else's conscience. They turned you into the caretaker of their shortcomings. And when you finally broke under the weight, they still wondered why you were angry. The Codex quietly closes this section, reminding you, you were never meant to carry words that weren't yours. There is a page in the Codex that feels heavier than all others, as if soaked in quiet humiliation. It records the apology you gave, even though the wound wasn't yours. You weren't wrong, yet you said, "I'm sorry," to hold the connection together, to calm the storm, to keep the peace. This wasn't surrender. It was survival. But the Codex shows the truth. Every misplaced apology carved a small piece out of who you were becoming. The empty chair shifts, as if remembering the moment someone let you take responsibility for their behavior. You apologized to avoid conflict they created. You apologized to soothe their ego. You apologized because their approval felt safer than your truth. The Codex does not blame you. It recognizes the fear behind your voice, the fear of being punished for honesty, abandoned for clarity, or unloved for being right. The book opens to a page where your reflection wavers, distorted by guilt you never earned. You see yourself saying, "I'm sorry," with trembling certainty, rehearsing a peace offering to someone who never once examined their own actions. You apologized, not because you failed, but because you were trained to rescue others from the consequences they deserved. And the Codex shows how deeply that training shaped your soul. The next page reveals what that apology cost. Every time you took blame you didn't owe, you taught your heart to distrust itself. You learned to second-guess your own feelings, to shrink beneath other people's narratives, to assume your truth was a burden. You learned to prioritize harmony over justice, even when the harmony was counterfeit. The Codex whispers, "You weren't wrong. You were silenced." The Codex closes briefly, as if grieving the version of you who believed their comfort mattered more than your dignity. The apology you gave when you weren't wrong became a blueprint for how you navigated relationships. Quietly, cautiously, apologetically, you paid with self-respect to purchase temporary peace. And they mistook your sacrifice for weakness, never seeing the strength it took to protect yourself from their chaos. There is a chapter in the Codex where the ink looks smudged, as if every sentence was written while holding back tears. This section records the moment their silence grew bigger than your truth. Not because what happened was unclear, but because their refusal to acknowledge it forced you into a world where doubt felt more logical than memory. Silence didn't erase the story. It replaced it, page by page, word by word. The empty chair sits perfectly still now, facing the table as if making eye contact with the book. Its stillness feels accusatory, not toward you, but toward the one who left you carrying the weight of their omission. When silence lingers long enough, it becomes narrative. You began to shape yourself around their refusal to speak, measuring your worth against their absence. The Codex mourns the way you learned to internalize someone else's avoidance. The next page reveals the ways your identity shifted beneath the pressure of unspoken truth. You became careful with your voice, hesitant with your needs, almost apologetic in your existence. Their silence didn't just hush the past, it modified your future. The Codex shows how you learned to whisper, even in moments where you deserved to be loud, because somewhere inside you, someone had taught you that your pain was inconvenient. You began rewriting your own memories, to make room for them, softening details, erasing cruelties, folding your truth into something less threatening. Their silence forced you into the role of historian and suspect at the same time. You doubted your hurt. You questioned your perception. You reinterpreted your own reality to protect someone who refused to face theirs. The Codex turns the page slowly, as if mourning the years lost to confusion. Silence is shape-shifting. At first, it feels like avoidance. Later, it feels like punishment. Eventually, it feels like confirmation. You began to believe the things their silence implied, not because they were true, but because nobody corrected them. Your story bent under the weight of what they refused to say. The Codex does not blame you for this bending. It shows how anyone starved long enough will mistake hunger for emptiness. There is a chapter in the Codex where every line feels prematurely faded, as if written before the ink had time to dry. This section records the wounds you forgave too early, long before you grasped their depth, intention, or consequence. Forgiveness was not healing back then. It was instinct. You forgave because you needed safety more than truth, connection more than clarity, belonging more than justice. The empty chair sits forward now, as though leaning into a confession it will never give. You remember moments where someone hurt you and you apologized to them anyway, or moments where someone crossed a boundary you didn't even know you had until it snapped. Back then, you forgave and you assumed understanding would only make the pain sharper, so you numbed yourself with mercy you hadn't even processed. The next page reveals how forgiveness became a reflex for you, a survival mechanism shaped by old wounds. When you forgave too fast, you spared them discomfort but denied yourself comprehension. You never asked why they did what they did. You never asked what their silence meant. You never pursued the truth, because you believed your role was to absorb, endure, and continue. The Codex whispers, forgiveness without understanding is not peace. It is erasure. The room tightens around you, walls drawing closer as you read. You realize these early forgiven wounds planted seeds inside you, small distortions that grew into confusion, self-doubt, and emotional self-neglect. You forgave people who had no awareness of the damage they caused, and when the hurt resurfaced years later, you blamed yourself for feeling it, forgetting that forgiveness never erased what you didn't understand. The Codex closes this chapter by showing how much of your identity was built on misunderstood harm. You became hyper-aware of others' needs but blind to your own. You learned to soothe chaos you didn't cause. You learned to minimize your pain before anyone else needed to. These early apologies shaped your emotional architecture, leaving you compassionate but hollowed. You forgave everything except yourself for not knowing better. There is a section in the Codex where every page feels bruised, as if touched by hands that had no right to mark it. This chapter records the guilt you inherited, not through actions, but through proximity. Someone else made the choices. Someone else caused the damage. Someone else broke the trust. But you were the one who carried the weight. Their guilt seeped into your bones because you were the only one willing to feel what they refused to face. The empty chair leans subtly toward the table, as if mimicking the posture of someone who once expected you to shoulder their burden. You remember the way they sighed, the way they deflected, the way they painted themselves as misunderstood. You've stepped into their shame before they ever acknowledged it. You carried responsibility not out of obligation, but out of habit, the habit of protecting others from the consequences of their own silence. The Codex reveals a truth you've long sensed, but never articulated. Guilt is contagious when you're raised to absorb emotional messes that aren't yours. You learn to apologize for tension you didn't create. You learn to fix moods you didn't disrupt. You learn to take blame simply because no one else would. The Codex whispers painfully, you weren't guilty, you are convenient. As you read further, the room dims until only the book remains illuminated. You see all the ways that borrowed guilt shaped your identity. The hyper-responsibility, the overthinking, the fear of confrontation, the instinct to make everything smooth, even when you're crumbling. This guilt made you smaller than your own story, teaching you to be the emotional custodian of people who never cleaned up after themselves. The Codex closes this chapter with a quiet but firm realization. You are allowed to return this guilt to its rightful owners. You are allowed to stop absorbing what does not belong to you. You are allowed to unclench the parts of yourself that have been clenched for years. Their guilt shaped you, but it does not define you. You were never meant to carry these shadows. It was simply the role you were assigned before you knew you had a choice. There is a chapter in the Codex where the pages turn themselves, as if to read of waiting for someone who will never arrive. This is a section where you stopped hoping they would explain, confess, or repair what they broke. Closure did not. Come from them, it came from the moment you accepted their silence as the final answer. Not because you wanted the story to end, but because continuing 2. Weight felt like being slowly erased. The empty chair sits perfectly aligned with the book now, as though acknowledging its own vacancy. You once believed closure required dialogue, truth, reconciliation, but the Codex reveals something harsher. Some people protect their version of the story more fiercely than they ever protected you. So, you became both witness and healer. You had to tell yourself what they never told you, that your pain was real, your memory valid, your story whole. The next page shows the moment you stopped rehearsing conversations in your head, stopped imagining apologies, stopped waiting for someone else to free you from the narrative they twisted. Closure came when you finally realized they weren't withholding the truth. They were avoiding responsibility. The Codex whispers, you didn't walk away because the wound was small. You walked away because they refused to see it. Closure is rarely loud. It arrives slowly, like a quiet door closing in a distant room. You didn't get a final explanation, a final conversation, a final reassurance. You got a choice. You recognized that your healing could not depend on someone who refused to acknowledge the harm. The Codex shows how you pieced yourself back together. Not perfectly, but intentionally, replacing their silence with your own clarity. This chapter ends with a truth the room seems to hold its breath for. Closure is not a gift someone else gives you. It is a boundary you create. You did not need their apology to move forward. You needed your own permission. Permission to stop waiting. Permission to stop bleeding. Permission to reclaim the parts of yourself that were trapped in their silence. The Codex closes softly, acknowledging your strength without demanding your forgiveness. There is a final section in the Codex where the pages feel warm, as if ill'd be, hands gentler than any you've known. This chapter isn't written by those who hurt you, it's written by the version of you who finally stopped abandoning yourself. These are the words you waited for from others, not realizing they were meant to come from your own mouth. The Codex opens slowly, inviting you to read what you've never been told. The empty chair glows faintly now, no longer a symbol of absence, but of return. You see your younger self sitting there quiet, hopeful, exhausted. You realize the apology you needed most wasn't from them. It was from you. The Codex reveals the words you've withheld for too long. I believe you. I'm sorry you had to face this alone. You didn't deserve the silence. You didn't deserve the blame. You deserved compassion, not confusion. As you turn the page, the words soften into truth you can finally hold. You were not too sensitive. You were not imagining it. You were not the problem. You were surviving. You were adapting. You were doing your best in circumstances that asked too much of you. These are not affirmations. They are recognitions. The kind only you are qualified to give, because only you lived the entire story without turning away. The next page offers the hardest sentence of all. I forgive you, not for being wrong, but for not knowing how to protect yourself sooner. 4. Blaming yourself for their failures, for carrying guilt that belonged to others, for staying silent to keep the peace, for loving people who didn't know how to love you back. The Codex records this moment carefully, as if aware of its significance. This is the apology that finally frees you. As the chapter nears its end, the room shifts. The chair no longer feels empty. The silence no longer feels accusing. The Codex closes with words that settle into your chest like a steady heartbeat. You deserved better, and you still do. You are allowed to stop grieving the apology that never came. You can speak your truth now. You can reclaim your story. You can return to yourself. And you can stay. This is the first apology that truly heals.